The barren moon of Veskera 9 hung silent and gray beneath a thin, fractured sky. Its landscape was carved by centuries of violent winds, its soil cracked and pale like bone. No life stirred across its canyons, save for the dozens of alien cadets who stood gathered at the base of a massive metallic arch that marked the starting point of the Galactic Academy's final trial. The wind howled through the hollow crevices, scattering dust over their armor and skin, whispering like the ghosts of past failures. Each cadet stood beneath the flag of his species, ready to prove superiority in the ancient art of combat. But this time, the instructors had changed everything. Weapons were forbidden. No plasma blades, no rifles, no energy shields, no drones, no exosuits. Even simple metal tools were banned. Only instinct, intellect, and bare hands were permitted. When the rule was announced, the crowd had fallen into stunned silence. For some, it was like asking a bird to fly without wings. The reptilians grumbled about dishonor, the insectoids clicked their mandibles in confusion, and the crystalline species simply stood motionless, unable to comprehend the point of a trial without bloodshed. But one figure among them, the lone human cadet, Marcus Vale, felt a strange thrill awaken in his chest. He had been waiting for something like this. Marcus was not the strongest nor the fastest among the cadets. His species, still young by galactic standards, was seen as fragile, overly emotional, and reckless. The other races saw humanity as a curiosity, unpredictable and clever, but lacking discipline. Yet, as the rules echoed through the amplifiers, Marcus's sharp brown eyes narrowed with interest. He knew what this trial truly tested. It wasn't about killing. It was about thinking, about control. The commandant's voice, cold and metallic, boomed over the canyon. You will survive for 7 cycles. You will eliminate your opponents by neutralization, not death. Those who break the rule will be expelled from the academy. Begin. A low hum rippled through the cadets as their tracking implants activated, marking the start of the challenge. Some sprinted immediately toward the rocky highlands, seeking vantage points. Others scattered toward the ruins that dotted the southern valley. A few formed uneasy alliances, knowing that cooperation meant safety, at least until betrayal became convenient. Marcus did not move. He stood still as the wind lifted his short dark hair and filled his lungs with the scent of dust and metal. His heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with focus. The others saw the moon as a battlefield. He saw it as a puzzle. When the others had vanished beyond the dunes, Marcus crouched low and studied the terrain. The ground was a blend of fine ash and shattered stone, too soft for heavy footsteps, yet firm enough to leave clear impressions. That meant tracks could betray positions. The cliffs rose high on both sides of the valley, their surfaces pockmarked by natural alcoves, perfect hiding spots if used carefully. He removed his academy insignia and tucked it inside his uniform, not out of disrespect, but because reflective surfaces caught the sun. Small details could kill. He had learned that from his father, a survival instructor on Earth, who once told him, "The first thing a soldier loses in war is visibility. The second is reason." As the twin suns began to rise, the heat thickened, pressing against his skin. Marcus moved toward the nearest canyon wall, his boots barely disturbing the dust. He knew that in the first few hours the strongest would attack, the weak would hide, and the arrogant would reveal themselves. His best weapon now was patience. From a narrow ridge, he watched as a group of alien cadets, tall insectoid creatures with chitin armor and blade-like arms, set up camp near a rock formation. They argued, their voices sharp clicks and shrills, debating who should lead. Marcus smiled faintly. Leadership through noise, predictable. He memorized their movements and slipped away before they could sense his presence. By midday, the temperature climbed beyond endurance. The air shimmered, and even the wind seemed to burn. Marcus found shelter in the shadow of a collapsed structure, the remains of an ancient outpost long devoured by time. The walls were corroded, but the geometry was sound. He traced his fingers along the surface, feeling the grooves that once held power conduits. The place offered cover and perspective, high ground, narrow access points, and several escape routes. It would serve as a temporary base. He gathered stones and debris, rearranging them to block the entrance from view. He used torn fabric from his training uniform to create shade filters, dimming the bright reflections that might reveal his location. Hours passed. The silence grew heavy. Somewhere far away, a deep thud echoed. A skirmish, perhaps. Marcus knew that the first eliminations would come quickly. The overconfident always struck first, exhausting themselves before strategy had time to breathe. He conserved energy, rationed his hydration packs, and watched how shadows shifted across the ground as the suns drifted west. The moon's rotation was slow, its light unpredictable, perfect for misdirection. When the suns dipped behind the horizon, the world transformed into silver and darkness. Most cadets would fear the coming night. Marcus welcomed it. He waited until the stars appeared, their faint glow reflecting in his eyes. Then he moved. His body blended into the darkness as if the shadows themselves had learned to walk. He retraced his earlier steps, following the same insectoid group he had observed before. Their campfire glowed faintly, a mistake born from arrogance or fear. Fire drew eyes. Marcus circled the perimeter, his breathing controlled, every movement deliberate. He observed how they placed their sleeping nests, where the guards stood, how they rotated shifts. He counted their heartbeats in the rhythm of the night. War, he thought, was not about strength. It was about listening. He gathered smooth stones, a handful of dry reeds, and fragments of reflective metal. Using a piece of vine, he rigged a crude alarm near his hiding spot, a system that would rattle if anyone approached. Then he began mapping the terrain in his mind, marking escape paths and sound channels. He noticed how sound carried differently through the canyon. Deep voices echoed longer, light footsteps faded faster. With this, he could predict directions of movement, even in total darkness. By dawn, he had built the foundation of something greater, not a weapon, but a web. The next day began with chaos. From his vantage point, Marcus saw smoke rising from the western dunes. Another group had been ambushed. The rules forbidding weapons had only sharpened the cadets' cruelty. Now they used fists, claws, and sheer intimidation. The instructors had called it a lesson in restraint, but Marcus saw it for what it was, a mirror reflecting each species' nature. Some resorted to savagery when stripped of their tools. Others crumbled. Only a few adapted, and adaptation was humanity's oldest art. When a trio of crystalline cadets passed near his shelter, their bodies glowing faintly from internal energy, Marcus pressed himself flat against the wall. The light bent and shimmered as they scanned the ruins. He waited until their glow illuminated a patch of the floor he had deliberately disturbed, a faint trail leading away from him. They followed it. A few seconds later, the unstable rock beneath them gave way, sending them sliding into a shallow pit. He hadn't dug it deep enough to harm, only to trap. Their pride would hurt more than their bodies. He watched silently as they struggled, muttering curses in languages he didn't understand, and then he disappeared back into the canyons. By the third day, Marcus had not yet engaged a single opponent, yet his influence could already be felt. Others began whispering about the Silent One, the human who did not fight, yet could not be found. Some thought he had fled. Others feared he was everywhere. The myth was forming faster than the man himself. Marcus didn't seek glory. He sought understanding. He knew the trial wasn't testing combat skills alone. It tested what happened when violence was no longer an option. And for him, that meant creativity became the sharpest blade of all. That night, as he sat on a ledge overlooking the valley, he watched faint lights flicker from distant camps. The air was still. He could hear the distant rustle of movement. Perhaps someone stalking, perhaps someone retreating. He closed his eyes and let the moon's silence sink into him. In that stillness, he realized something profound. If this world forbade war, then the only way to survive was to redefine what war meant. The trial was not about killing. It was about control, not of others, but of oneself. When the third sunrise painted the cliffs red, Marcus descended into the valley again, his shadow stretching long across the dust. He moved with purpose now, silent but certain. He would not fight with fists or weapons. He would fight with the ground beneath his feet, with light and darkness, with fear and calm. The others had come to prove strength. He had come to prove understanding. And in a world where death was banned, he would show them that the mind, sharp, patient, and unseen, was the most dangerous weapon of all. When the third sunrise bled through the pale haze above Veskra 9, Marcus was already moving along the canyon ridges, his steps careful and almost soundless. The air was sharp and dry, filled with the faint hum of the Academy's observation drones high above the cliffs. He knew they were watching every motion, recording every heartbeat, analyzing every act of aggression or restraint. Somewhere behind those lenses, instructors debated which cadets had the instincts of warriors and which were destined to fail. Marcus wasn't interested in pleasing them. He was interested in surviving the right way, without crossing the one boundary that defined this trial: no killing. By now, the moon's heat was fierce enough to warp the horizon. The landscape trembled in the shimmer, making distant shapes blur into illusions. Marcus had already learned that the environment itself could become an ally. Shadows stretched like living creatures when the suns tilted, swallowing corners and creating false forms. He walked through the canyons with his jacket tied around his waist, sweat running down his back, eyes constantly adjusting between glare and shade. Every shadow was a potential weapon, every echo a message. The ground beneath his boots told him more than any map. He could sense where others had passed, how many, and how recently. He had started to think not as a soldier, but as something older, closer to a hunter. By midday, he reached a section of the canyon where the cliffs converged into a narrow corridor. The wind funneled through it, creating low, rhythmic vibrations like a living heartbeat. Marcus crouched near a sharp bend and ran his fingers along the rock surface, feeling how the vibrations changed with each gust. Sound could travel far here, and in war without weapons, sound was everything. He pressed a small piece of metal he had scavenged from the ruins against the stone and tapped it lightly. The echo stretched out and returned in less than a second. That meant the corridor was short, enclosed, and perfect for control. He began to memorize how the air moved through it, where it widened, where it tightened, and how the temperature shifted at the edges. Soon he saw not a canyon, but a map of sound and shadow waiting to be used. As the suns lowered, Marcus found a cluster of crystalline fragments embedded in the canyon floor. They shimmered faintly in the dim light. He broke off several pieces, cleaned the edges, and arranged them in patterns along the ridge. At the right angle, they would reflect light into the corridor below, disorienting anyone who entered. He smiled slightly, remembering an old lesson from Earth about ancient warfare. Control the light, and you control the fight. He wasn't planning to fight at all, but confusion was a kind of weapon too. He spent hours testing how the reflections danced when the suns moved. He discovered that by changing the position of a single shard, he could turn the whole corridor into a maze of false motion. It would appear as if someone was running ahead when no one was there. By dusk, the system was perfect. The canyon became a stage, and he was its silent director. Night came quickly, dragging with it a thick layer of mist that clung to the rocks. The temperature dropped sharply, and a faint layer of frost began to form where shadows lingered. Marcus climbed to a ledge overlooking the corridor and settled into a crouch. His body was sore, but his mind was clear. He didn't need to attack anyone. He just needed to make the others defeat themselves. Below, faint lights began to appear. A patrol of alien cadets moving cautiously, their skin glowing faintly with bioluminescent patterns. He recognized their movements, disciplined, calculated, and rigid. They were from the Valori species, known for tactical precision and a complete lack of improvisation, perfect opponents for a trap built on unpredictability. The Valori squad entered the canyon with slow, synchronized steps. Each carried a pulse tracker strapped to the chest, a device meant to detect movement by scanning heat. Marcus knew those tools worked best in open terrain, not in narrow, echoing spaces like this one. He waited until the lead cadet's light struck the first crystal. The beam bounced, split, and scattered across the rock walls, creating ghostly silhouettes of movement. The Valori froze instantly, misreading the reflections as multiple ambushers. One of them raised his hand in warning, his expression hidden behind the thin membrane covering his face. Marcus exhaled quietly. The first step of confusion had worked. He picked up a flat stone and flicked it across the canyon wall. The echo ricocheted like a whisper from 3 directions at once. The Valori leader spun toward the wrong side, signaling his squad to flank an enemy that didn't exist. In the process, they crossed directly into the tightest part of the canyon, the part Marcus had memorized perfectly. He waited for their footsteps to align, and when the wind shifted, he dropped another stone into the passage below. It struck a pile of loose gravel, triggering a small cascade that sent dust clouds rising into the air. The Valori shouted orders, their formation breaking. Marcus watched as their lights blurred, reflected, and multiplied through the crystals. They struck at shadows, tripped over uneven ground, and collided with each other. It was chaos born from precision, the opposite of what their training allowed them to handle. Within minutes, they were scattered and retreating. None were hurt, but their composure was gone. The canyon that had seemed safe now looked haunted. He learned how to mimic the breathing rhythm of different species by adjusting the way he walked and exhaled. The galactic instructors had designed the trial to strip cadets of their tools, but Marcus realized that no one could strip him of awareness. Knowledge was not a tool. It was instinct refined by will. At one point, he encountered a lone cadet from the Avon race, tall, with skin resembling polished stone, her eyes glowing faint blue in the darkness. She was injured, limping, and trying to drag herself up a slope. Marcus hesitated. The rules didn't forbid helping others, but mercy was often mistaken for weakness. Yet he could not ignore her struggle. He approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. She watched him warily, expecting a trick. He knelt beside her and cut a strip of cloth from his sleeve to wrap her wound. She said nothing, but didn't resist. When he finished, she stared at him in disbelief. "Why?" she finally asked in a low, rough voice. "Because I can," he said simply. Then he left her without another word. That small act carried farther than he realized. By the next evening, whispers spread through the remaining cadets. The human was unpredictable. Some said he was a manipulator, using kindness as a tactic. Others said he was simply insane. Marcus didn't mind either interpretation. Confusion was still control. The following night, he camped near a natural arch that overlooked the lower plains. The wind moved differently there, carrying scents and faint vibrations from miles away. He sat in silence, watching the stars shimmer through the thin atmosphere. He thought about the strange peace he felt. No killing, no destruction, yet every moment carried the pulse of battle. It was a kind of war the others didn't yet understand. A war of thought, patience, and empathy. To win this kind of fight, one had to know not how to destroy, but how to lead the chaos itself. Marcus realized then that he wasn't just surviving. He was learning something profound about his species. Humans had always been shaped by limits. When denied strength, they found creativity. When denied weapons, they found tools in the dirt, the light, the silence. He looked down at his hands, bruised and covered with dust, and felt no fear of what was to come. Somewhere across the canyon, the next group of cadets was already on the move, hunting him, convinced that the human would finally make a mistake. But Marcus had already chosen the next battlefield, the night itself. He closed his eyes and whispered to the wind, almost as if speaking to the moons above. "Let them chase the shadows. I'll be waiting where the light ends." The night passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of wind through the high ridges of Veskera 9. Marcus barely slept. He had grown accustomed to the planet's unnatural rhythm, heat by day, frost by night, and the constant tension of being hunted by beings who wanted victory more than understanding. When the first light began to pierce the horizon, he was already awake, crouched near the edge of a canyon, his eyes scanning the lower plains. The trial was entering its third cycle, and he could sense the shift in behavior among the surviving cadets. The early arrogance had faded. Now, fear had begun to move between them like smoke. The rules of this world were changing, and only those who could read its new language would survive. He adjusted the strap of his pack and began to descend the ridge. The air was heavy with dust, and the sun's glare was almost unbearable. His throat ached from dehydration, but he rationed what remained of his water. Every step had to serve a purpose. Below, the land opened into a flat basin scattered with fragments of blackened stone. It looked like an ancient battlefield, scarred by explosions that had happened centuries ago. Twisted metal structures rose from the ground like the skeletons of forgotten machines. Marcus moved between them, studying how the shadows shifted with the rising light. The ruins were a gift, places where light could deceive, where sound could lie. He crouched beside a pile of debris and examined the terrain. The ground here was loose, the sand dry and unstable. Each movement left a deep print. That meant anyone crossing it would leave evidence of direction and speed. He began to think in terms of traps, not for killing, but for control. A trap did not need to harm to succeed. It only needed to change an opponent's choices. He spent the next hour shaping the terrain with quiet precision. He carved shallow lines in the sand that looked like drag marks of something heavy, leading toward a collapsed bunker. Then, several meters away, he pressed his own bootprints in the opposite direction, erasing the true path he had taken. By the time he was finished, the basin was a map of lies. He climbed onto one of the metal frames to survey the area. In the distance, he saw movement. 4 cadets moving in formation. The sunlight glinted off their armor, marking them as part of the Garan faction, a reptilian species known for brute strength and endurance. They advanced quickly, searching, confident. Marcus watched their pattern, how the leader moved a few paces ahead, how the 2 in the middle scanned the ground, and how the 4th lagged slightly behind, guarding the rear. Their formation was solid, but predictable. He whispered to himself, "Predictability kills faster than any weapon." Then he disappeared into the ruins. He circled around them, keeping to the shadows. The metal structures distorted sound, bending it in strange ways. A single step could echo in the wrong direction. Marcus used that to his advantage. He broke a small piece of metal and tossed it across a hollow beam. The clang bounced off several surfaces, sounding as if it came from behind the Garans. The squad froze immediately, their scales rippling with irritation. The leader hissed and gestured sharply. The others turned, scanning for a target that wasn't there. In that brief pause, Marcus acted. He released a handful of dust into the air and crept into the half-collapsed bunker, positioning himself behind a broken wall. The Garans followed the false trail he had left earlier. Their heavy footsteps sank into the sand, leaving deep impressions. When they reached the bunker entrance, the leader barked an order, and one of the middle cadets stepped forward. The moment his weight hit the unstable sand, it gave way. A shallow pit opened beneath him, not deep enough to injure, but enough to send him sprawling. The others rushed forward to help, and Marcus triggered the next part of his plan. He had arranged the debris so that one of the metal plates would fall at the slightest disturbance. It crashed down between the Garans, splitting their formation and showering them with dust. The air filled with noise and confusion. Marcus slipped out through a gap in the rear wall, silent as the shifting sand. From a safe distance, he watched as the Garans regained control. Their leader's rage was visible in every movement, scales flaring, tail slamming the ground. The pit was harmless, but the humiliation was not. In this trial, losing control meant losing respect. Marcus could see the frustration spreading through their ranks. They began to shout at one another, their discipline fracturing. He had turned them into his weapon, not through strength, but through misdirection. He moved north toward a series of narrow ridges that cast long, uneven shadows across the land. As he climbed, he saw more signs of struggle below. Tracks, scorch marks, shattered gear. The number of active cadets was dwindling. The once coordinated movements of squads had dissolved into scattered individuals. The trial had begun to eat its own participants. From the ridge, he spotted 2 figures fighting near a cluster of rocks, one of the crystalline species and one of the avian race. The crystal warrior swung with brute force, his luminous limbs cutting through the air, while the avian darted swiftly, wings flaring for balance. Marcus didn't intervene. He simply observed how easily desperation turned training into chaos. As night approached again, he found shelter inside a cavern formed by intersecting cliffs. The temperature dropped quickly, and a cold mist filled the space. He built no fire. Warmth was not worth visibility. Instead, he arranged small stones into patterns around the entrance, tuned to collapse or shift if disturbed. The subtle sounds they would make were enough to wake him. When the moons rose, their pale light entered the cave through a narrow slit, reflecting faintly off the metal fragments on the ground. Marcus sat there in the half-darkness, sharpening his mind instead of weapons. He thought about the pattern forming in this trial. Every species had approached it as a limitation, a punishment. No weapons, no glory. But for him, it had become freedom. He could fight without killing, control without destroying, and influence without touching. The idea fascinated him. War didn't have to end with death. It could end with understanding, if one side learned the language of restraint. Yet he also understood the danger of such thinking. The academy wasn't built to honor restraint. It was built to produce conquerors. He suspected that his success, if it continued, would not be welcomed by the instructors. Perhaps the purpose of the trial was not to see who would adapt, but to see who would disobey. A faint sound interrupted his thoughts. A scrape of stone, soft but deliberate. Someone was near. Marcus froze, every muscle tensed. He waited, listening. The next sound came from the left side of the cave, near the narrow slit of moonlight. A silhouette appeared, slender, cautious, moving low. The figure paused, scanning the darkness. Marcus reached for a loose stone and tossed it gently to the opposite side of the cave. The sound drew the intruder's gaze for a split second. That was enough. Marcus lunged forward, pinned the figure by the shoulder, and twisted him into the light. The intruder was a young cadet from the Fenari race, humanoid, with silver-blue skin and eyes that glowed faintly like frost. His expression was startled, but not fearful. "You're the human," he hissed softly. Marcus tightened his grip, but did not strike. "What do you want?" he asked. The Fenari hesitated. "To understand," he said. "No one can catch you. The others think you use forbidden tech. I wanted to see what makes you invisible." Marcus released him slowly, stepping back. "Nothing makes me invisible," he said quietly. "I just move where others refuse to look." The Fenari's eyes flickered with something like respect. "You fight without fighting," he said. "It's strange." Marcus nodded. "Strange, but effective." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the Fenari straightened, dusting off his uniform. "I won't tell the others what I saw," he said. Marcus met his gaze. "It doesn't matter if you do," he replied. "They won't believe you." The Fenari smiled faintly, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Marcus remained still, thinking about the encounter. Not all enemies had to be confronted. Some could be redirected, like wind through stone. When dawn came again, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The trial was approaching its breaking point. The survivors would soon converge, drawn together by the Academy's hidden countdown. Marcus knew the next phase would not be about hiding. It would be about revelation, about showing what he had learned. He stepped out of the cave, stretching his arms toward the rising light. The suns burned across the horizon, painting the canyon walls in crimson. The world felt ready to shift again, and so was he. From this point on, traps and shadows would not just be tools, they would be lessons. And he intended to teach them to everyone who still thought that victory required blood. The fourth dawn of the trial arrived beneath a blood-orange sky. Thin clouds drifted lazily above the canyons, painted crimson by the twin suns of Veskera 9. Marcus stood at the top of a ridge, the wind whipping through his hair, carrying the sharp metallic scent of dust and decay. He could feel the shift in the air, the calm before the storm. By now, the number of remaining cadets had dwindled to less than half. The distant howls of triumph and defeat had grown fewer each night. Those still standing were no longer impulsive or reckless. They were silent, calculating, and dangerous. Marcus understood that the next phase would test not just intellect, but endurance. Every strategy he had used, the traps, the manipulation of light and shadow, had earned him both survival and attention. The others had begun to speak of him as if he were an unseen force haunting the wasteland. Some feared him. Some wanted to prove his humanity was overrated. And among them was Karth Varn, the reptilian commander who had survived every encounter with brute force and arrogance. Marcus had watched him from afar, recognizing that their paths were destined to cross. Karth wasn't just a rival, he was a mirror, everything Marcus refused to become. As the morning heat rose, Marcus began his descent from the ridge into a series of ravines that cut deep into the surface of the moon. The terrain here was treacherous. Narrow paths, sharp drops, and loose stone that could collapse under the wrong step. He moved with precision, marking the ground with small indicators. A twist of vine, a stone placed deliberately to track his routes. Every choice was methodical. He wasn't wandering anymore, he was positioning himself. The ravines would be perfect for what he intended to do next, not to ambush, but to teach. By midday, he found a place that fit his plan. A narrow gorge surrounded by jagged cliffs and scattered boulders. The sunlight reached it only in fragments, leaving deep shadows where the rock walls leaned together. Marcus knelt and studied the space as if reading a book. The ground was uneven, soft in places where the sand had piled over the years. That softness could be shaped. He began to dig shallow trenches with his hands, arranging them in patterns that forced anyone entering to step where he wanted. He used vines and thin metal scraps to form tension lines, connecting them to loose stones overhead. He worked for hours, sweat dripping from his brow, his movements precise and unhurried. By the time the suns began to descend, the gorge had become a quiet labyrinth. Marcus had crafted not a battlefield, but a lesson. Each trap was designed not to injure, but to disarm and reveal the arrogance of whoever tried to force control. He sat behind a boulder, hidden in the deepening dusk, and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the sound of heavy steps echoing through the canyon. Karth had arrived. The reptilian cadet moved with the confidence of a born predator. His scales glistened faintly under the light, and his breathing was steady. Behind him followed two of his subordinates, smaller but equally formidable, their tails sweeping the ground as they scanned the surroundings. Marcus could hear their voices echoing between the cliffs, low, rough, confident. Karth had hunted others for days, eliminating rivals one by one. To him, Marcus was simply the final obstacle. Karth stopped near the center of the gorge and called out, his voice deep and sharp. "Human, I know you are here. You've hidden long enough behind your tricks. Face me like a warrior." The sound reverberated through the stones, scattering dust from the ledges above. Marcus didn't respond. He watched. He had no interest in fighting on Karth's terms. One of the subordinates moved forward, sniffing the air. His foot pressed against the first tension line. A soft click sounded, followed by a sharp release of dust and gravel from above. The small rock slide startled them, not harming, but blinding. Karth hissed in irritation, swinging his tail against the cliffside. "Cheap tricks," he snarled. But Marcus noticed something shift. For a moment, Karth's posture changed. The leader wasn't just angry, he was unsettled. Marcus used that moment to move silently along the wall, using the shadows to stay invisible. He tossed a small stone to the opposite side of the gorge. The echo made Karth spin instantly, his instincts betraying him. The second subordinate lunged toward the sound, only to step into another trap. A thin vine snapped beneath his foot, triggering a narrow pit that collapsed just enough to swallow his leg. He roared in frustration, pulling himself free, but the damage was done. The formation was broken. Marcus climbed higher along the cliff, positioning himself above them. From there, he could see everything. The arrogance in Karth's movement, the confusion spreading through his men. He waited until Karth stood directly beneath him, then dropped a small pouch filled with powdered sand. The pouch burst upon impact, releasing a cloud that clung to Karth's face, covering his vision. The reptilian bellowed in fury, thrashing wildly. His subordinates tried to regain order, but Marcus was already gone, moving through the network of ledges he had mapped earlier. When Karth finally wiped his eyes clear, his rage had consumed reason. He roared again, his voice echoing across the canyon walls. "You think you can humiliate me with games, human? You're nothing but prey." He charged toward the deeper end of the gorge, following a faint movement that Marcus had allowed him to see. Each step led him deeper into the maze of traps. Marcus followed from above, silent, watching. At the gorge's end stood a wide opening, illuminated by the last light of the setting suns. The heat made the air shimmer, distorting vision. Karth stormed into it, scanning for movement, his claws flexing. Marcus stepped out from the shadows onto a ledge above him. "You're chasing the wrong thing," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the rock. Karth looked up, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You hide because you're weak," he spat. Marcus shook his head. "No. I hide because I understand. You fight because you fear silence." Karth roared and leapt toward him, claws slicing through the air. Marcus stepped aside, using the narrowness of the ledge to redirect the attack. Karth's momentum carried him forward, forcing him to grab the edge to keep from falling. Marcus crouched and met his eyes. "You don't need to destroy to win," he said quietly. For a moment, something flickered in Karth's gaze. Confusion, disbelief. Then his strength gave out, and he slipped, landing in one of Marcus's pits below. It wasn't deep, but it trapped him completely. Marcus climbed down slowly, his movements measured. Karth's fury had burned out, replaced by exhaustion. He tried to rise, but the sand beneath him shifted, making it impossible. Marcus stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at him. "You call yourself a warrior," he said, "but you fight shadows and call it courage. What you fear isn't me. It's the silence that shows you what you really are." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind. Then Marcus reached into the pit and offered his hand. Karth stared at it, his jaw tight. Pride warred with understanding. Finally, he took the hand, allowing Marcus to pull him up. When he stood again, his eyes were no longer filled with rage. He looked at Marcus differently now, not as an enemy, but as something he couldn't define. "The trial will end soon," Marcus said. "You can keep fighting the same way and learn nothing, or you can walk out of here knowing what power really means." Karth said nothing. He simply nodded once, then turned and left the gorge with heavy steps, his subordinates following in silence. As darkness fell, Marcus sat on a boulder and watched the stars emerge through the thin atmosphere. His heart was calm. The lesson had been given, though he didn't know if it had been understood. He hadn't defeated Karth with strength or traps. He had defeated him with restraint. The realization settled over him like the night air, cool, quiet, and absolute. In the distance, faint lights glimmered. The instructor's observation drone still watching. Marcus looked up at them, knowing they had seen everything. He wondered what they thought of this kind of victory, one without blood, without glory. Somewhere beyond those machines, the Academy's commanders would be debating what it meant. To Marcus, the answer was simple. War was not about destruction. It was about awareness. And for the first time since the trial began, he felt no desire to fight again, only to show others that war could end before it ever began. The final day began in silence. The suns rose slow and pale, as if even the sky had grown weary of the endless struggle that had played out beneath it. The wind moved softly across the cliffs of Veskera 9, carrying with it the scent of metal, ash, and old dust. Marcus stood on a high plateau overlooking the expanse of the trial ground, the place that had tested every cadet's endurance, intelligence, and soul. Below him stretched the remains of what had once been a battlefield, but now looked more like a graveyard of ambition. Scattered shelters lay half buried in sand, and trails of footprints wound aimlessly toward nowhere. The trial was nearly over. The surviving cadets had received their final transmission the night before. The test would end at sundown, and the last one standing would be named the victor. Marcus felt the weight of those words, but not in the way the others did. To him, victory had lost meaning. Over the last days, he had seen how easily pride collapsed when stripped of weapons. He had seen what arrogance looked like when silence answered it. He had watched beings who once called themselves soldiers turn into frightened children, clawing at shadows. Yet in that chaos, he had also glimpsed something else. The possibility of understanding. If violence could be unlearned, perhaps peace could be taught. That idea was worth more than any medal or honor the Academy could offer. As the day warmed, Marcus began his descent into the plains, where the final confrontation would unfold. He didn't need to search for his opponents. They would come to him. The air was dry and heavy, filled with the faint hum of energy from the observation drones circling high above. The instructors were watching every movement, recording every breath. Somewhere beyond the atmosphere, in the sterile halls of the Academy's control chamber, commanders waited to see which philosophy would win. The one of brute strength, or the one of quiet intelligence. Marcus stopped near a large formation of fractured stone. The structure rose from the sand like the ribcage of some ancient creature, its hollow spaces echoing faintly with wind. He decided to make his stand there, not to fight, but to finish what he had started. He cleared the ground of loose debris and stacked a small pile of stones at the center, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. To him, it represented everything he had learned here: patience, control, and purpose. By mid-afternoon, he saw a movement in the distance. 3 figures emerged from the heat haze, advancing steadily toward him. One was unmistakably Karth Varn, his scales dulled from exhaustion, but his posture strong. The 2 others were unfamiliar, cadets from different species, both hardened survivors, their faces marked by the strain of too many sleepless nights. Marcus watched them approach without raising his guard or taking cover. He stood in the open, calm and still, his hands empty. Karth was the first to speak when he came within range. His voice was rough, not with anger, but with something that sounded almost like respect. "You knew we would come," he said. Marcus nodded. "Of course. The end always draws those who think they can claim it." One of the others, a tall, crystalline female whose body shimmered faintly with internal light, narrowed her eyes. "You talk as if you've already won." Marcus smiled faintly. "I didn't come to win. I came to finish learning." The words unsettled them. The concept of fighting for anything other than victory was alien to most cadets. Karth studied Marcus quietly. The last encounter between them had changed him, though he still carried the instinct of a warrior. "The instructors want a spectacle," Karth said. "They want blood, even if it's forbidden. They'll reward whoever gives it to them." Marcus looked toward the drones hovering far above, their lenses glinting like cold stars. "Then maybe it's time we give them something else to remember." The crystalline cadet moved first, circling to Marcus's right, her movements graceful and deliberate. The other, a broad-shouldered avian male with a sharp crest, followed from the left, wings twitching with tension. Karth remained still, watching both Marcus and the others, as if waiting to see what kind of fight this would become. Marcus made no move to defend himself. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the clearing and spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the canyon. This trial was supposed to teach us how to fight without weapons, but it failed to ask the more important question, why we fight at all. The crystalline cadet hesitated for a moment, her light flickering uncertainly. Marcus continued, "You think victory means survival, but it doesn't. Survival means nothing if you don't understand what you've survived for." His calm tone disarmed the tension more effectively than any attack could. The avian male shifted uncomfortably, his wings folding closer to his back. "You think words will change the result?" he asked. "The Academy doesn't care about lessons. It only cares about outcomes." Marcus met his gaze. "Then I'll make this the only outcome worth remembering." Before the others could react, Marcus moved, not to strike, but to dismantle the fight itself. He reached for the nearest piece of stone and threw it into the dust between them. The sound echoed sharply, drawing every eye to it. Then he stepped back and raised his hands. "The ground is our battlefield," he said, "but I refuse to turn it into a grave." The others stared at him in disbelief. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind pushing through the cliffs. Then Karth stepped forward, his heavy tail dragging behind him. "You would rather surrender?" he asked. Marcus shook his head. "No, I'm ending the war before it begins." The crystalline cadet clenched her fists. Her light brightened, and for a moment Marcus thought she would attack. But Karth raised a hand, stopping her. He looked at Marcus with the weariness of someone who had fought too many pointless battles. "You're either a fool or a prophet," he said quietly. "Maybe both." Marcus smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what the Academy needs. A fool who refuses to play by its rules." Something changed in that moment. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a strange stillness. The crystalline cadet lowered her hands, her glow dimming. The avian male stepped back, uncertain. Karth remained where he was, his expression unreadable. The drones above continued to record, their lenses reflecting the fading light. The instructors were witnessing something they hadn't prepared for, a confrontation without violence, a victory without defeat. The suns began to set, casting long shadows across the ground. Marcus turned his eyes to the horizon, where the light bled into the darkening sky. "The trial is over," he said softly. "Not because one of us won, but because none of us needed to lose." The others said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The silence stretched, deep and profound, as the last light vanished behind the cliffs. Moments later, a loud chime echoed from the drones, the signal marking the end of the trial. A faint hum followed as holographic projectors activated above them, displaying the crest of the Galactic Academy. The voice of the Commandant filled the air, amplified across the canyon. "Cadets, the trial has concluded. Your results are being recorded. Prepare for retrieval." His tone was neutral, but Marcus could hear the hesitation beneath it. The outcome had not matched expectations. When the extraction craft descended, its engines stirring the dust into spirals, Marcus remained still. Karth looked at him one last time. "You changed the trial," he said. "Not with force, but with silence. I don't know if the Academy will reward you or punish you for it." Marcus smiled faintly. "It doesn't matter. What's done here will outlast their judgment." Karth gave a slow nod before stepping toward the craft. The others followed, their movements quieter than before, as if each carried something unseen, a fragment of understanding. As the engines roared and the craft lifted off, Marcus stayed behind for a moment, standing alone on the plateau. He looked around at the empty battlefield that no longer felt hostile, only quiet. The wind brushed against his face, cold and clean. For the first time since he arrived on Veskera 9, he felt peace. Not the peace that follows victory, but the peace that comes from knowing no one else had to fall. When the next dawn rose, the trial site was empty, but the story of what happened there would spread through the academy faster than any rumor. It would be said that on the forbidden moon of Veskera 9, a human taught the galaxy's fiercest warriors that war could be fought without killing, that strategy could replace violence, and mercy could redefine victory. In time, the lesson would become legend, and Marcus Vale's approach would be studied under a new name, the doctrine of the Silent War. And though Marcus never sought fame, his name would live in every cadet who learned to see strength not as domination, but as control, not as the power to destroy, but as the power to choose restraint. The wind of Veskera 9 would carry that truth long after the dust of the trial had settled, whispering softly through the canyons that once echoed with screams, now silent as understanding itself.